Welcome back to the South by Southwest EDU Studio. Our next guests are here from the Groundswell Project, an organization dedicated to countering violent extremism. Please welcome Hadiya Masieh and Maeve Park to the studio. Hi guys.
Hello.
This is a really interesting topic, so I want to dig right in. How do you define extremism, and what type of extremism are you seeing in schools?
Okay, defining extremism, $1 million question. Because everyone's like, what is this? But I've just come back from the conference and described it as a virus with different strains, because there are patterns by which they operate. So extremism preys on vulnerable people, divides communities, they market what they do very well. And those are the patterns of every strain of extremism. So you can have anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, racism, male supremacy. They're all different strains of the same thing, of hate. And if we approach it in that way, we have more likelihood of being able to, challenge this virus.
Are you seeing it in the schools a lot?
Schools, yes. So we go around explaining how people can go down extremist routes, and it can happen to anybody. And recently we came across schools being very, very worried around male supremacy and misogynistic views. To mention a name, Andrew Tate.
Oh.
So the students there were using his symbols, and female teachers were being very, very worried about the impact this type of ideology was having on the male students, and even the female students, like feeling very uncomfortable with these types of ideologies. So in schools, that's like a predominant strain that we're seeing at the moment. But there are obviously strains of anti-Semitism, white supremacy, religious extremism. It's out there among the kids.
So how do you really track extremist speech? I mean, are there trends that you're like right now tracking?
Well, there are organizations and obviously tech companies that are there looking at the various data where they can see extremist ideologies and groupings that use social media, because that's the best way to spread, and you target many, many people. Mm-hmm. How you actually challenge that is also $1 million question, because it's something that will always be there. And even if you get rid of it, it will be, it'll come back again. So our approach is to inoculate communities and children and young people that this is what it looks like. Safeguard yourselves away from this type of dangerous ideas, and then we can, hopefully try and come up with a solution.
Is there one type of extremism speech right now that worries you the very most?
I think I'd be most worried about misogynistic extremism, but I always think that the alt-right or white supremacist extremism is always in the background, and also a lot of these other forms of extremism are kind of almost like gateways into more kind of white supremacist ideology, even if it's not obvious, usually like through subtle narratives around gender roles, race, beauty. So definitely misogynistic extremism, but also, the alt-right and white supremacy.
You've done a lot of work on incels. Can you explain incelism and the threat that it poses?
It's a very complicated kind of a movement or kind of situation. Not all incels are violent, not all of them are even misogynistic, but it's all very nihilistic, very depressing, very kind of doomsday-ish. So I think like a lot of what we're seeing with incels is that kind of like nihilistic ideas of the future is kind of just devoid of happiness that we're seeing a lot of young kids kind of like feeling as well, which is why I think they're drawn into even like school shooter fascination or other forms of violence as well. So yeah, it's a very nuanced topic, but a lot of it is very highly depressing.
And what are the differences between US extremism and say UK extremism?
I think, again, using the virus analogy, not very much. The COVID that affected people in the US was the same as the one that affected people in the UK. The internet allows the spread of these types of ideologies. So you see people being affected by Andrew Tate in the UK, the same as they are in the US, identical. So I think there's more of the school shooting issues here, obviously, in the US, more than there is in the UK. But otherwise, the extremist ideologies don't differentiate like country by country. They just want this ideology to spread.
So what are some of the signs that teachers could look for that could signal a burgeoning extremist view?
Well, in the UK, we're quite lucky. We have the UK government program called the Prevent Project. And this is where teachers and statutory workers in the health services are trained to detect these types of signs, and they are given information on the various strains of ideologies like religious extremism, white supremacy, and that type of training allows them to know when to flag a child that has an issue. Mm-hmm. So if you've trained teachers to look for these signs, which are often people speaking about ideologies, a very them and us rhetoric that they have, Islam versus the West, or migrants are affecting the UK population, like some very broad kind of concepts, very black and white views. Mm. So if they start speaking in that way, the teachers would definitely flag something up in the UK. In fact, it's a statutory obligation for them to do that.
And they can, by flagging, they can report it to them.
Yeah, so once that they flagged it up, it'll go to the local government or the police, and then we have an intervention provider who then goes into the school. I'm actually an intervention provider myself. I've worked with girls in 2014 who were being drawn into ISIS territory. So I was responsible for doing de-radicalization with these girls.
Wow. I mean, that sounds like an incredible experience. Were you able to break through?
Yes, I was. I was able to help them.
How did the pandemic impact the rise in the type of extremist speech?
Well, we did a feature of that in Time magazine around how it impacted it massively.
Yeah.
Because if they are sitting online, basically waiting to prey on young kids, during the pandemic, where were they? Online. And so there was, massive interactions with some of these vile views and ideologies that were just getting into the brains of young people. So it was pretty impactful. And one of the teachers made a really interesting observation. Mm-hmm. And said the kids who are now like 14, 15 years old are quite susceptible to some of the misogynistic views online, because during COVID they were all homeschooled. And so it's that cohort of kids that didn't really have interaction at school that they are most worried about. So it's had this lasting impact in a way.
And they were coming through a lot of applications that were social, but also games, I've noticed. I'm a mother myself and was at home, and I could hear over some of the things like simple building games where conversations could be public.
Yeah.
Shut that down.
Yeah.
What are the differences between right-wing extremism like white supremacy and misogyny versus left-wing extremism like anti-capitalism or anarchy?
Back to you, Maeve.
The ideological differences or the methods?
Either. Like, what do you find is the difference between the right and the left as far as their extremist views?
Oh, well, their views do differentiate. Like, in terms of the right is far more interested in race, gender, looking at supremacy within races, supremacy within gender. They're anti-LGBTQ+. They're anti kind of equality with immigration and refugees. So they want that whole homogenous white society as much as possible. The left would be like, their ideology would be very different. They would be, more like pro-immigration, pro-refugee, pro-LGBTQ+. So there's a lot of more equality coming from the left than the right. So it's the extremes of those as well. So yeah, the ideologies differ. Methods, though, people can say could be similar at times, but we must always look at the fact that the far right have killed far more people than the far left in terms of the American context and NU context in Europe as well in the last 20 years.
So how do older extremists groom students, and do you have any examples?
Older extremists?
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, what I've been like subjected to and seeing during the time ISIS were recruiting, they're just very clever. They really understand, like they try to, it's grooming. So they really understand the situation of that young person or their target, and they'll offer everything to that individual, especially when they're in a low place. Maybe they've been bullied at school, maybe they've got issues at home. So like anybody who's kind of vulnerable at that point, that vulnerability would be played against them. So the methodology of an extremist recruitment is to offer something that individual's lacking. And I call this the Venus flytrap theory, where they'll bring in, entice people with things that they want to hear and things that they can, resonate with, and trap them until they are so enamored by maybe the individual or the ideology that if they get told to do the most horrific thing, which is, killing, they are so trapped at that point that they can't move out, and they'll actually go ahead and do that thing. So if at the point where they get asked to do something heinous, they then move away because it's like, oh my God, this is something that I can't do. That's the position that we want people to be at. But obviously we know that the Venus flytrap will get the victim, and it's then too late. So we're trying to get people before they get into that position.
So how can kids with loving, supportive families fall prey to extremists?
That's a really good question, because again, from my experience working 15 years in de-radicalization in both white supremacy and Islamist religious extremism, a lot of them just came from loving families as well. Like their child was just online with no protection. Parents in 2014 in particular didn't really know the dangers of online radicalization and who was waiting to like prey on their kids. What we have a Mothers for Change course, and that is educating mothers how they can protect their kids online. Because we like say, you wouldn't put your child in the middle of a road without showing them how to cross the road. So it's important that we educate mothers on, safety requirements, how they can make sure that they're looking at their children online, all of the options that are available to help safeguard their kids. So they find this program really, really helpful. Maeve actually delivers the course.
You deliver?
Yeah.
So can you explain the Hotel California effect?
So I thought about this when I was thinking about the incels in particular, because it's the idea of like, nobody wants to join a group where everyone's depressed, but sometimes when you feel depressed or dark, you find people like-minded. And with the incels in particular, they find themselves in this group because they don't want to be there, obviously, but then they find themselves like kind of stuck there because they've made friends. And also there's this kind of paranoia of what happens if I get out. Like, this kind of ideas that no one will like you, you'll never find a girlfriend, you're too ugly for everybody. So they get this kind of stuck where they don't want to be there in the first place, but then they don't want to leave. So that's why I thought about that song. It's like Hotel California, like you can check out, but you can never leave. So the idea of being drawn back into the darkness, and that really being like very difficult, very similar to addiction. So that kind of toxic pull.
Is they're playing on the innermost fears.
Yeah.
So what advice can you give teachers and schools about how best to deal with extremism when it pops up in the classroom?
Again, from the UK methods, we're lucky enough to be sponsored to go into schools and provide this support for teachers, because it is a scary place to be. Again, the girls who left Bethnal Green Academy, it's a famous school that they left to join ISIS, the teachers were shocked. And now obviously quite a few years on, they have got that type of support, but this, organisations like ours have the expertise that a lot of the teachers lack. I mean, why would they know all of these, different strains of ideologies and extremist ideology? So we are able to train them and the teachers as well, the students as well, to recognise what is out there to try and entice them. And when they know this information, that's been really appreciated. We've had thank you letters through our post saying, thank you, I didn't know about radicalisation before. And the teachers have called us back in, especially with the whole misogyny view as well. So we're happy to disseminate this expertise to schools worldwide, because that's what they're asking for, and we don't expect them to know all of this. It can be quite dangerous as well to say something wrong and make it worse.
Well, then should law enforcement be brought in immediately, or should schools first talk to parents once they've flagged it?
I think they need to speak to both. It has to be like a safeguarding, first and foremost, that we're worried about your child.
Right.
And, potentially there could be something dangerous that is going to affect wider society, a wider community, so we have to get law enforcement involved. So in the UK, it's a mix of both. And working with the police services, they've been very, very sensitive, and the approach that they've used has been, in my view, very useful, because parents, that's the worst thing they want to hear, that their child is going down something. But then, thank you for letting me know, because at least we can nip it in the bud.
So should teachers in schools be doing more to educate kids on extremism, as well as getting their information on and how they can verify it?
Did you answer that question? Can you repeat?
Yeah.
Sorry.
So should teachers and educators be doing more to have kids fact checked and verify where they get their information on their extremist views, and teach them how they can verify it?
Definitely. Like myself and Maeve, we go into schools specifically teaching the tools that when you go online, do you fact check? Do you just straight away believe something? And they are, extremely fundamentally useful tools for the children to know. Mm-hmm. And again, they thank us for telling them about these tools, because they don't often, it is like sending a child off in the middle of the road and not showing them. So they've been very thankful for the tools that myself and Maeve were able to give the teachers and the children. But as you said,
they're able to recognize it ahead of time before it penetrates.
Yeah, and that's what they're saying, like, oh my God, I didn't know that.
Right.
But thanks for telling me. Now I'll be more, diligent about the way that I go online. And that's not just, that's what makes us keep doing what we're doing, because the feedback has been so great.
Yeah, I mean, you clearly both have a lot of sympathy for kids that fall to extremism. How can we support those kids? How can we ensure that they don't slip back?
Well, this is what I give this analogy of, like a garden, that if you just neglect it, the weeds will keep growing. So this has to be a continuity of education, reminders that this thing can happen. It looks like this. When I was growing up, it was, don't speak to strangers and don't take lollipops from strangers.
Yeah.
It's the same thing, but I think there needs to be more done by governments on the whole of safety online. Like, it is a great place where you can find lots of amazing things and world-changing things, but at the same time there's a dark side to it. Warning, even the cigarette packets, you have warning, this is a health warning. The internet needs that health warning.
Yes. Well, I'm glad you guys are in the world and keep doing what you're doing. I really appreciate it. And thank you for coming by the studio.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So that's a wrap from the South by Southwest EDU studio this year. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed hosting this. All of you can watch our studio interviews at the South by Southwest EDU app and on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/@SXSW EDU. I'm your host, Kari Byron. So long from the South by Southwest EDU studio.